I think a real important thing to get into this documentary is the fact that you have a tribal government here that is recognized as the governing body of the Kickapoo Nation. And through that process, we are trying to use the laws that apply to self-determination on Indian reservation. I think the most important thing that we have got to do is make that law work in providing employment, education, and self-sufficiency for the Kickapoo tribe.
It's been a great detriment, that idea of thinking that all we have to do is go to the Great White Father's representative and he'll provide whatever we want. Because the ideal thing is for the tribe to get in a situation where they can provide their own things, their own kinds of needs, without assimilating, without becoming something else.
I had a hard time when I was trying to get a job. I had to go out and for myself, and they told me, you know, guy, you know, carpenter, Indian, you know, that's what they told me. And I see his places, I don't say all of them. And I didn't have no tools, you might say, when I started out, see. So I went ahead and I just kept on. Now down before I know it, I was pretty good.
It's a part of this whole idea of tribal sovereignty, tribal self-determination, tribal self-government. The trust responsibility is a responsibility to protect all that, to protect tribal sovereignty, to protect tribal self-determination, to protect tribal self-government, basically to protect tribes as tribes.
Sovereignty is the freedom to determine one's own destiny. Native Americans once had that freedom. It was their most valued possession. But it was taken from them by force and by treaty, and Indians were put on reservations and made wards of the federal government. Tribes that were once proud, independent nations were rendered practically helpless and, when not ignored, were scorned for their dependence on government handouts. But these tribes have begun to reassert their sovereign rights. They have taken their concerns to Washington, and they have won the support of legislators and presidents. And in 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act was passed. This act, Public Law 93-638, marked a sharp break from the previous century of U.S. Indian policy. Earlier policy had sought to assimilate Indians into the mainstream of American culture. But Indians refused to abandon their heritage. They successfully maintained a distinct identity, but by the mid-1970s they had become, by any standard, the most underprivileged group in American society. Moreover, federal paternalism, as implemented by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had made the reservations into administered communities which were prevented from independently managing their own affairs. The Indian Self-Determination Act seeks to reverse this policy. It acknowledges that prolonged federal domination has served to retard rather than enhance the progress of Indian people and their communities. And its goal is to provide maximum Indian participation in government and in the education of the Indian people. The Kansas Kickapoos are using the Self-Determination Act to create a vital and effective Indian-run community on their reservation. Their progress and their problems tell a story of one tribe's quest to regain its sovereignty.
The thing that started it off that we can remember real easily now is that back in 1970, in the early 70s, President Nixon, even though he's very controversial, talked about Indian self-determination for the Indian people, and was a fantastic idea. It was a thing that certainly helped our people because it was the vehicle that we had needed for a lot of years. And in 1975, the Congress appropriated money for the Indian Self-Determination Act, and that, in essence, was the starting point.
Of course, the law itself doesn't guarantee any program or any development. I think we all realize that. But it came about, ironically, coincidentally, at the time that we had a lot of tribal activism. People were concerned at that time because I reiterate this, we had, in my estimation, we had a puppet type of a government that was managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And when people begin to study that issue and begin to realize that, they begin to realize that they, as tribal leaders, should educate themselves, should become more aware that really the Kickapoo tribe should be governed by its own Kickapoo government.
I think the success for 638 depends on tribal governments and BIA officials, their ability to use it and to administer it. It's not really good until you learn to use it, you implement it like we have done here. We've contracted for some services. I think with that experience we'll find out that we do have to do more contracting. We have to put that responsibility at the tribal level, tribal government level. Let us make our own decisions, determine our own destiny, whereas before the Bureau had been doing it.
The tribes in the past never had too much input and voice in the programs that are developed and administered by the government. And under this Indian self-determination, it gives the Indian tribes Indian input and a stronger voice in the administration and the funding of these programs.
So what exactly are the ultimate goals that Indian self-determination is moving toward?
Well, the goal in Indian self-determination is to see that the tribes can administer their own programs and become more self-sufficient.
Let's back up just a second and look at the Self-Determination Act itself. Really, you can break the act down into two major parts. The first is a policy statement. It talks about redressing certain problems and grievances that have historically troubled Indian federal government relationships. Secondly, it establishes a contractual mechanism that tribal organizations can use to contract or gain grants for services from the federal government. The idea being that by running these programs made available by the federal government themselves, the Indian people will have a chance to exercise self-determination through providing government services to Indians through an Indian delivery system.
In Indian self-determination, the tribes presently carry out several programs under Public Law 93-638, which is the Indian Self-Determination Act. Presently, the tribes administer and contract from the Bureau programs such as housing, aid to tribal government, road maintenance, agriculture, education, Johnson O'Malley, and so on and so forth. These programs are available to the tribes to contract their portion of the funds that is received by the agency for their use in these programs.
Some people would say that, and I would include most of the tribal officials I've worked with, some people would say that by the time you get through following and adhering to the regulations of Indian Self-Determination Act programs, that in fact what you have is self-assimilation. Instead of the federal government directly intervening to force Indians to change their way of life, in effect you have the federal government giving assimilation type programs to Indians to administer themselves.
To what extent does self-determination really work the way the law says it should work?
I believe that, well, when they first passed the law, of course, and the Secretary wrote up regulations to enforce the law, there was a great deal of resistance on the part of the Bureau, and you can see why. Bureau employees would be losing their jobs. The more programs and services were contracted out from the Bureau, the less Bureau employees there would be. So for the first couple of years, the Bureau tried to put up as many obstacles as they possibly could. For example, a tribe would want to enter into a contract for a social service program, and they'd sit down to negotiate the contract out with the Bureau. And the Bureau would present all these, what they call declination issues, where they can decline to contract. For example, if a tribe can't take over the service, well, then the Bureau doesn't have to enter into a contract. But it was more than that. It was every single issue they would fight the tribes on. Finally, in the last couple of years, that situation has been somewhat resolved, and there are specific guidelines now that Indian Health Service people have to follow and the Bureau has to follow. So that is no longer the major problem that it once was. There still is, I believe, a great deal of resistance on the part of the Bureau. There's still a feeling that we know what's right for you.
You know, and a lot of times people get that mixed up. They'll say, well, as the superintendent, aren't you the head of that tribe? I said, no, I'm the head of the tribe. I work for the federal government. But people have that they still believe that the Bureau actually tells the tribes what they can do and what they can't do on the reservation. And the only things that we can actually tell them to do, or what regulations they got to stay within, is the contracts or the grants that they get from the Bureau or the federal government. Then we can tell them they have to stay within these guidelines. Other than that, they run it. They have their own little agency up there.
While the Kickapoo have continually sought to attract private industry, thus far they've been unable to do so. As a result, if the tribe is to develop economic and political independence, it is going to have to continue to be heavily dependent upon the federal government. In essence, tribes, the Kickapoo and tribes in general, are in a catch-22 situation. They cannot become economically viable without massive federal supports over an extended period of time. They are prevented from obtaining this massive federal assistance because of the very nature of the federal funding structure. The federal government operates on a year-to-year basis. Funding is allocated on a yearly basis. It is extremely difficult to develop long-range plans and to achieve those long-range plans if you are subject to the changing whims of the federal government. A classic example of that is the recent events that occurred on the Kickapoo Reservation in the winter of 1981-82. The Kickapoo, as I've said, have been very successful economically, but in the winter of 1981-82, because of delays in passing the federal budget and because of massive cutbacks due to Reagan's economic policy, virtually all of the tribal funds were cut off. The Kickapoo went from an endemic unemployment rate of approximately 30%, which, by the way, is pretty good for an Indian reservation. Almost overnight, they went to an unemployment rate of 95%.
Our people here, we had a big layoff, I think, right in November, starting of winter. And people didn't have any incomes to buy food or to buy, propane and electricity to heat their house, keep warm. And as a result of that, we declared a state of emergency here on the reservation. We had, the peoples were running clear out of propane, and when they ran out of the heat, their houses were freezing up, and we had, I forget, we estimated something like $40,000 of damage done to the houses. Just by water freezing up on them.
Arthur Whitehead spent most of the day warming himself next to his wood stove. Already, many of the nearly 200 families who live on the Kansas Kickapoo and Potawatomi Indian reservations have abandoned their government-built homes to live with relatives or friends who have heat. The tribes use propane when they can afford it. This winter, most can't. Dozens of families in both reservations are without central heat. They burn dwindling supplies of wood instead. The tribal councils of the Kickapoo and Potawatomi reservations have declared a state of emergency. They blame the Bureau of Indian Affairs for doing too little, too late.
We declare the same thing, that we are in a state of an emergency, and it's not being responded to immediately.
The tribes say they need $40,000 in emergency aid to purchase fuel. They have rejected a government plan to dip into their already short school and housing budgets to buy fuel, calling that plan robbing Peter to pay Paul. During good times on the reservation, the average Indian family's income is less than $3,000 per year. But these are hard times. Because of federal cutbacks in Indian aid programs, the unemployment rate here has soared to a staggering 85%. Dennis Kern, Action 4 News.
Now, since that time, they have been able to regroup, regain some of their financial support, but still at present, the unemployment rate exceeds 50%. Very often whites say, why would Indians want to go to reservations where they can't work, they can't find a job? The major reason is that this is the Indians' homeland. This is where they can go and be Indian, can practice their traditional culture.
Because here on our reservation, we're a very traditional people. That's the reason the people want to stay here. That's the reason the people, even when they leave, they have this desire to come back, because it's a place where they can practice and participate in their ceremonies. They can practice their traditions. And those of us who are in positions of leadership should always have that in our minds, that our purpose is to provide that situation where our people, if they want to, can spend their entire lifetime and all of their time on living the traditions, practicing the traditions, participating in ceremonies, teaching the younger people. It's something that needs to be maintained because it has within it those qualities that would help man develop beyond his present state. Because we can look at, even now, look at the countries, how they conduct themselves, and they haven't changed from the idea of the caveman's thinking. They still believe if you carry the biggest stick, then you're the head man, you're the leader. Within the Indian way of life, that kind of thinking doesn't exist. It's not there. There's a different way of thinking. There's a different way, or a way of developing beyond that. And that's the kind of thing that we need to reestablish here.
Well, what are you thinking of when you say the old way?
Well, the old traditional way. Freedom. I get my freedom. I can go out here and then pray, and I can go out here and hunt, and then I can go out here and dance, and I can do anything I want to here on the reservation. That's what I call freedom. I can't do that in the city. If I get to make a noise in the city over here, well, there'd be somebody call up and say, that man's crazy over there. He's drumming, he's hollering and doing this and that. That's what I mean by freedom.
When we first hear of the Kickapoo in 1634, they lived in the region of the Great Lakes. Never numbering more than 3,000, they lived in loosely defined bands, subsisting by hunting, gathering, and horticulture. Although they occupied fixed villages during much of the year, the Kickapoo were always known for extensive and frequent movement and relocation. This migratory pattern was exacerbated by the steady invasion of their territory by the French, English, and later the Americans. During the 18th century, the Kickapoo moved south into Illinois and Indiana and began breaking up into small bands which united around particular leaders. During the early 19th century, one band, under the leadership of the prophet Kennecook, became entirely independent. The Kickapoo tribe in Kansas are the descendants of this group. Noted for being adaptive, the Kansas Kickapoo adopted many features of the dominant white society. Nevertheless, they held to their Indian heritage in spite of steady encroachment into their affairs by the federal government. Following the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the Kickapoo formed a tribal government consisting of an elected tribal council. One of the main goals of the tribal council was to improve economic conditions on the reservation. This was not an easy task, since there were no industry, commerce, or natural resources with which they could create jobs for their people. Consequently, many Kickapoos migrated to the cities to find work, thus straining their ties to each other and to the land.
One of the clearest proofs that the Self-Determination Act is important to the Indians in the way that I described earlier is that they have seized it as an opportunity to be Indians on Indian land. And once they perceived that this was the case under the law, they began to return to the reservation with the idea that they would use federal programs and federal resources to establish a Kickapoo life. Maybe not the same Kickapoo life that existed 100 or 200 years ago, but something that satisfies the current definition of what a Kickapoo is.
I first started coming up to the reservation in the summer of 1976. At that time, the tribal administrative facility consisted of 2 trailers. There was a trailer here and one adjacent and joined here. And all the tribal administration was housed in those 2 trailers. The Indian Action Team had a trailer here, that is their construction company. But that was it. I mean, you can see the parking lot here is extremely small. Since that time, almost all of the facilities development on the reservation, all of the facilities development on the reservation has taken place. There were those trailers, there was a housing complex up here, and a housing complex over here, and that was it.
At about that period of time, the Kickapoo, not unlike a lot of tribes in this country, we're seeing a lot of Indian people move back from the urban areas, in our case such as Kansas City and Wichita and Topeka and St. Joe. There were homes here to live in, but it also brought back the type of Kickapoo people that came from an urban area that knew that there were programs, that there were government services available, that there was expertise to be brought in, that there were community development programs available. Or in fact, they may have jobs. They may have had jobs in community development programs. They simply brought back their expertise and their concern and commitment to the Kickapoo Reservation. If you hadn't seen it, I think that it's important that you review a planning document that was completed by the tribe in 1975, a planning document that came about as a result of surveys conducted with tribal members as to what they wanted. It gave us some time schedules. It also listed at that time the federal resources that were available to build these facilities, such as the gymnasium, the trading post, which is a mini shopping center for the tribe, a library, a print shop, more housing construction, a senior citizen center, road construction, road improvement, daycare facility, a water treatment plant, and a tribal farm and ranch. These have all been identified, not by chance, but these have been identified in a tribal plan that was documented in 1975.
And at that time, I think the secret understanding, not secret, but not voiced understanding, was that we figured there would be federal monies there for us for maybe a period of 6 years. before things changed, before the tide changed in a sense. And as it turned out, that's pretty much how it happened.
The tribe has been immensely successful in attracting development, in building buildings. They have unfortunately been less successful in terms of maintaining those. The trading post is now no longer in operation. The tribal library, while they were able to obtain the monies to build it, were unable to obtain the funds to put books in it, to provide the necessary resources and supports that one needs for a library. The reason for that is in the very nature of the federal funding structure. Federal funding really, because it's on a year-to-year basis, prohibits any kind of long-range planning. The federal government is more than willing to give you money to build buildings, but they're less willing to give you the kinds of supports that you need to maintain those buildings, put those buildings to the purpose that they are intended for. Basically, that's what happened with the library. When they got the grant and began building, there was enough money there allocated for books, but by the time it was finished, the cost overruns due to inflation and so on, there was no money left. And they didn't have money for desks, they didn't have money for bookcases or books. They turned it for a while into a part of the tribal office system. Now it's been turned into a youth center with pool tables and other kinds of recreational facilities. They have had a very rational plan, and they have had a very good idea of where they want to go and what times they want to go. The problem has been that because they're dependent upon federal dollars for that development, they very often cannot proceed in a rational, realistic way.
Self-determination is not dependent on the federal assistance dollar. It's certainly supported by it. Self-determination is supplemented by the federal dollar. We face severe cutbacks, but we've started a program, a plan on attracting industry several years ago of attracting industry to the reservation. One of the things that we badly need right today is an industrial park facility, or if not a full-fledged industrial park facility, we need places to house industry. We need either a commercial building or buildings, commercial buildings to house industry. But our infrastructure and the basic facility is our water treatment plant. When you look at the development of economics, when you begin economic development, you must have a good water supply, and we have that.
One of the biggest problems that Indian people across the nation have is that since the reservation concept, the Indian people have been told, stay on your reservation. The Great White Fathers came and told the Indian people, stay on the reservation. You don't have to do a thing. I'll bring everything to you. I'll provide everything for you. And over the generations, our Indian people have come to depend upon that kind of thing happening. And certainly, not to the benefit of the Indian people themselves. It's been a great detriment, that idea of thinking that all we have to do is go to the Great White Father's representative and he'll provide whatever we want. Because the ideal thing is for the tribe to get in a situation where they can provide their own things, their own kinds of needs, without assimilating, without becoming something else. And the main essence of it is that the older people talked about the Indian people, the tribe, relying upon its own resourcefulness, developing to the point where they would be free from, in a sense, the federal government, free from having to depend upon the federal dollar.
Do you think with the Kickapoo Reservation is only 6 by 5 miles, and within that not all of that land belongs to them, do you think they can ever really become self-sufficient from the federal government or without major federal supports, given that small resource base that they have?
Well, it's too bad that the tribes do not own more land than what they do on the reservations here in Kansas. Apparently, years ago, they took advantage of selling this land. Now, the tribe can't sell the land, but the individual allottees, the individual Indian people that own their land, can apply and can sell this land out of trust or back to the tribe.
In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a series of treaties with the United States government pushed the Kickapoo south and west, steadily reducing the tribe's land base. In 1832, the Treaty of Castor Hill provided the Kickapoo with 768,000 acres in northeast Kansas, and in 1834, 750 Kickapoo took up residence on this reservation. Over the next 2 decades, white settlers, anticipating the creation of the Kansas Territory, steadily encroached on Kickapoo lands. However, rather than protect tribal lands guaranteed by the treaty, the government sent agents to purchase the land. In 1854, the tribe ceded 618,000 acres of their reservation for 49 cents per acre. But the 1854 treaty did not satisfy the white man's desire for Kickapoo lands. Indians still held 150,000 acres of rich crop, pasture, and timberlands. Thus, in 1862, the Kickapoo Allotment Treaty called for the assignment of 160 acres to each family head and 40 acres each to other tribal members. Those not wishing to accept allotments could combine their share with others and hold the land in common. Reservation lands which remained after allotment, approximately 125,000 acres, were declared to be surplus and sold to the Atchison and Pikes Peak Railroad for $1.25 per acre. Resistance to this allotment was strong. 2/3 of the tribe chose to retain their lands in common, and this area, 19,200 acres, became the present Kickapoo Reservation. But pressure to break up the reservation continued. In 1887, the Dawes Act was passed, which sought to break up all Indian reservations into individual holdings. The Kickapoo continued to resist this policy, but an 1890 presidential executive order required that they accept allotments. By 1900, steady pressure from the federal government had forced all tribal members to accept allotments, and the Kansas Kickapoo tribe no longer owned any of their once extensive domain. In recent times, the Kickapoo have sought to reassert their tribal ownership and control over non-Indian lands within the boundaries of the reservation. Of the total reservation land base of 19,200 acres, at present roughly 3,500 acres are held communally by the tribe, and an additional 3,690 acres are held by individual Indian allottees. The tribe's present land base represents only slightly more than 1% of the land area which, in 1832, the federal government guaranteed as their permanent place of residence as long as they remain a tribe.
One of the goals of the Kickapoo tribe is to buy back as much land as we possibly can. We have bought back over 2,000 acres in the last 5 years. Hopefully that someday that the tribe will own all of the land back, but that's a pretty hard task for the council to go with the money that we do have. We're buying back land that was once ours, and a tribe is only as big as its land base. If you don't have a land base, you don't have very much to go on, and that's what sovereignty is to us, is to own our own land and to determine our own destiny.
Yeah, before the tribal farm got going here, it's been 3 years ago, there wasn't any attempt by the tribe as a whole to have any farming operation or
Well, we always had it in mind, but we didn't have enough land until we, you know, bought more land, and right now we've got about 3,300 acres, and we've got enough land now to, you know, to go into it pretty good.
How'd you get that extra land?
Well, we borrowed money from the Bureau to buy the land. Right now we're in debt to the Bureau for about $1 million, but we've got a lot of land for security and got a lot of equipment. Probably got $500,000 worth of equipment, modern equipment here. I mean, I guess farming, just like any other business, it takes money to get into it, and you know, and really you don't show any profit until you get your bills paid off.
Yeah, when you got to borrow a lot of money, you got to pay the interest rates too.
Yeah, well, that's one area that we're real fortunate in. We're probably paying 8%, which is a lot less than what, you know, the banks charge.
Do you think that would cause resentment with some of the other farmers around here, or do you get any feeling for that?
Well, I don't think so, because some of them get FHA, 5% FHA money, you know. And then again, I guess there's a lot of them doesn't, you know. But I think there was some resentment when we first started farming, because in the past we always rented our land out to non-Indians, and we got the idea if they could make money, we could make money. We could try to make some money too. I don't know. That kind of remains to be seen, I guess. We like to think we'll make it.
What's the difference between, you think, this operation here, the tribal farm, and some of the individual privately owned farms around?
Well, I don't know. They've been farming all their lives, and we've only been here, you know, like I say, 3 years, and we're just in the learning stages, but I think we probably will learn as we go. I know when I used to live right down here, and the gentleman we bought the farm from, Reuben Finger, you know, and in my younger days, I was probably hunting squirrels, and he was learning how to make money working on a farm, you know. He was probably feeding cattle while I was hunting squirrels, and that's why we've got a lot to learn in farming business too. Yeah.
And education is something that's great to anybody. And education it takes an education to get anywhere anymore. And then that's the only way that we're going to survive. I figure that's our weapon today. As of today, it's our weapon, our education.
Well, during the 1970s, the early 1970s, when the tribe first began to take advantage of the opportunities created by the Self-Determination Act, they began to attract a lot of people back to the reservation. As these people began to return, they brought their children with them, and they began to have children, and the number of Indian students at the local school, Unified School District 510 in Powhatan, began to increase. By 1980, Indian students made up approximately 76% of the total student body. At that time, the school district began to experience what could be described as white flight. Local farmers, especially farmers on the reservation, around the reservation, began to withdraw their children from the public school and send them either to private schools or to public institutions in adjacent school districts.
Powhatan USD 510 was formed in 1968. However, the high school building is only 5 years old. It cost about $1.3 million, but between $950,000 to $1 million of that amount was paid for by the federal government because Kickapoo tribe members living on this reservation are part of the district. That's another factor that has made the Powhatan district unique. About 76% of the district's students are Indian, but the cooperative effort to secure funding to build the new high school in 1975 was apparently not enough to keep some district patrons from sending their children to neighboring school districts. This school year, 21 Powhatan district students went to Hiawatha School, 32 to Horton, 14 of whom live on the reservation, and 2 students attended Jackson County USD 335. Why the exodus?
Part of it is some of the patrons, I'm sure, have a feeling that their particular children were not getting the quality education that they thought maybe they should be getting.
Gail Clevenger, News 13.
Naturally, in the beginning, it was the very wealthy, influential farmers began sending their kids out of the district because they were prejudiced. They seen a lot of fear in all the Indians moving in. You know, they were getting really paranoid, saying all these Indian students are coming in, they're moving in, they're going to take over, and I'm going to send my kids out. And they were having meetings and telling each other, our children aren't going to get a good education as long as there's Indian students in there. So they began sending their children out.
In 1980, the feeling was that the school cost too much to operate, that the Indians did not pay their fair share of the tax burden because their land is not included on the county tax base or the school district tax base. And there was a referendum to shut down the school. And in fact, the referendum carried by a very small vote, I think by a margin of 3 votes. And the school was scheduled to be closed down, and this would have involved the busing of Kickapoo students to various schools in adjoining school districts. The tribe felt very strongly that this, in effect, would break up their children. It would take them away from their community. It would deprive them of contact with their own peers, with other Indian people, and was, in fact, an insidious plot to speed up assimilation on the reservation. They mounted a rather remarkable campaign, I think, to acquire the buildings that the old unified school district had operated out of. And at the same time, they mounted an offensive in Washington to acquire BIA and whatever other kinds of federal funds they might to run this school. To make a long story fairly short, they were able to get the support of several prominent legislatures in Kansas, and they were able to extract a promise from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to fund the school, at least at a marginal level, as a tribal school. And by tribal school, I mean that it's operated under a 638 contract. They receive money from the BIA, but it is not a BIA school, it's an Indian contract school, and in this case, the Bureau of Indian Affairs serves only as a conduit to channel funds from the federal government to the tribe.
I think this thing really only happened because the tribe forced the Bureau to come through on their commitment. The Bureau, they love making verbal commitments, and this was one that the tribe forced them to carry through. And it would not have happened if the tribe hadn't done that. Because Bureau people were saying, not only Bureau people, but state people were saying, you'll never get that school. You don't know how to operate it. They were basically saying, you don't know what you're doing.
They thought, simply because we were Indian people, that we could not run a school. They thoroughly believed and anticipated that our school effort would not last a full year. They were gleefully waiting for the day when we would say, well, we can't do it, we'll have to close down. So many people believe that it could not happen. So many people who, you know, would like to be known as educators, so-called educators, they thought, no, the Indians can't do that. But the Indians did that. The Kickapoo did. And we're very proud of that. See, our Indian people have been taught to believe for a lot of years that, you know, let the white man educate your children. Because this is a white man's world. You've got to learn how to live in a white man's world. So let the white man educate your children. So our people have been conditioned that way.
As an Indian child, having known growing up, and you can see it every day, a child that studied history in school will end up wanting to be a settler or a cowboy, because the Indians aren't presented in a very good light. They were the savages. They killed women and children. They weren't protecting their land, but they were, you know, aggressive and nasty kind of people. There was a conflict there. Indian people were defending their lands and defending themselves, and it should be presented in a way that will leave an Indian student being very proud that his forefathers did the very best that they could to protect their way of life. And I think that's not being done. That's what we do. We teach history from a viewpoint where students can be proud, and that's what most of the other Indian schools do.
School has become more of a reality to our students, because now we have more Indian teachers. The majority of our teachers are Indian people. In past years, we tried to get the other school board to hire Indian teachers, and they always came up with the old sorry excuse that they could not find them. Today, our students see our teachers, our Indian teachers. They live in our own housing sites, in our own housing complexes. Those teachers are coming from the same environment that our students come from, and so school has become a real thing to them. They say, hey, school now is not such a foreign thing. It's not such a frightening thing, because this teacher here, she lives right next door to my grandmother or my cousin or my uncle, my aunt, whatever. They relate. Those people in education now are coming from their very own community, whereas before this didn't happen. Education and school was completely foreign to the Indian student, because they didn't see the teachers. They didn't relate to the teachers, you know, because they were all non-Indians. It's just totally different. The thing is turned around completely for our students. They feel now that education is something that is part of being Indian, whereas in the past our education was, you know, something other than being Indian. It was foreign to being Indian. They thought, well, if I do well in school, somehow this makes me less of an Indian, because that's the kind of dialogue and attitude that the school people were, you know, teaching to our kids. They were teaching them to be ashamed of who they really were, because the teachers themselves didn't know who these kids were. But when you have Indian teachers, that's turned around. That's different. Everybody knows who they are now.
If you don't have self-determination in education, then you can try all you want to, but self-determination, I guess education is the base unit. You can try, you can allow outsiders to educate your children, and then when they're adults, try to bring them back around, but I don't think that's not the way it works. That doesn't work. I think that you've got to have education. That's vital. There are other areas, of course, where it's very important. Self-government, you know, sovereignty, the rights for policing and those sorts of things, sovereign issues. But without education, I think it'll be short term. That's, to me, of course, being an educator, that's the key to it.
And I think it would be very interesting to watch the changes academically, socially, culturally, from the very year that school began Be very interesting to watch it, because there's no way that you can compare it when it was a public school to what it is now.
We're talking about the attitudes, and our attitude as Indian people has been so maligned to the point where Indian people do not have confidence in themselves, where Indian people do not have confidence in their fellow Indian, because again they're all taught to believe that, hey, it's the white man's world. All that was a con job. So our people, our Indian people, as a people, were caught up in that, and even today some still believe that. But it's only a white man's world if that's what you want it to be, if you let it be. And again, it gets back to the fact that, first of all, one of the most important things is that you've got to know who you are, and then you can look at the world from a whole different perspective and say, hey, that's not a white man's world, that's my world. That's the kind of thing that needs to happen. That kind of attitude change. If you believe that you're in a foreign world, and it'll always be foreign to you.
One of our major parts of this curriculum for the high school this coming year will be for tribal government. And instead of studying the state government or the federal government, which we will later down the way, but the base unit of government here for Kickapoo students, or for Potawatomi students that we have here, is their tribal government. We want to teach them about the government, the tribal government, how it came to be, what it is now, how it's organized, where it could, what's the future role, that sort of thing. And we want to teach us a sort of tribalism, as opposed to the students down the road who are being taught their base unit of government is like the county and so on. And we're part of the state of Kansas, but that comes later. And that's basically strong tribal feelings is going to definitely, down the road when these students become adults, have a great impact on self-determination.
The United States long ago made a contract with these tribes by entering into the treaties. The tribes ceded their land, and Congress gave them certain specific rights under the treaties, one of them being that they would retain their sovereignty. When I say sovereign, I mean that the tribes are separate nations. I guess that's the only way to describe it. They are citizens of the United States, they are citizens of Kansas, but they are also members of the Kickapoo or the Potawatomi or whatever tribe in the country. And there has been a whole body of law, federal Indian law, that's been developed to deal with that issue of sovereignty. The Kickapoo tribe in Kansas is a nation within a nation. The Kickapoo Nation is within the boundaries of the United States. And they have certain attributes of sovereignty that have never been taken away from them.
Tribes did have a sovereignty that was recognized as being a complete and total sovereignty. A sovereignty where the tribes could and did govern their own people internally within the tribe and also engage in external sovereignty, relationships with other nations, whether they be tribal nations or nations of non-tribal people. What the tribes have lost is the external sovereignty. Federal law does not recognize that tribes maintain to this day an external sovereignty, but what federal law does recognize is that tribes maintain an internal sovereignty. And often Indian tribal powers are related or compared to, I should say, municipal powers. And Indian tribes are often said to possess the same kinds of governmental authorities that municipalities have. But that's really an understatement, because Indian tribes have a great deal of the sovereign authority that states have.
What's do you see as the responsibility of the federal government to Indians?
Well, federal government, the government made a promise way back there, but they never did fulfill their promise. They just bypass it.
What promise is that?
Well, they promised that they was going to help the Indian all his life. They was going to help him, and that goes way back there. When they promised it, they made papers, they made documents, they made it black and white. The Indian says, well, he said you could use your paper, but he said I'm going to use my instruments. He says I'm going to use a pipe, and I'm going to use a smoke, and I'm going to use everything that deals with nature. As long as the grass comes up and the water runs and the sun comes up. That's how long my word goes.
If you can make the federal government, the United States government, live up to its treaties, live up to the promises that it makes in those treaties, then sovereignty becomes a real thing. But if you allow the United States government to, again, shirk its responsibility, to renege upon promises, and in essence to break the treaties, then it has no meaning at all.